Chapter 16. The Brotherhood of Monks. God, light, freedom, and immortality are and have ever been the loftiest aims of man, as well as his innermost aspirations. Throughout the ages, his urgent spirit has persistently swayed towards these eternal peaks. Yet the present state of humanity only shows how far the modern world has swung from these higher aims and efforts. As though discouraged by constant attempts of his forebears to reach those greater levels, present man has deliberately chosen to plunge into the depths of obscurity and chaos. Or so it would seem to be. But behind this present trend of apparent degeneration, there is in fact a greater purpose, which becomes more evident when we inquire more fully into the general movement of nature herself. Here we can see in the wide sweep of evolution that there has always been the same principle at work. The clash of opposites as the challenge for an ultimate reconciliation has throughout been the fundamental condition whereby a new status of being could arise. It was in this way that the mobility of life forms had emerged from the static lifelessness of matter, and by the same means that a purposeful consciousness had issued forth from the blind instinctive urge of life. So it would now seem that the light, which has thus been for man the living symbol of a higher stage beyond, should itself need the darkest night of obscurity before its dawn can fully emerge into the world of humanity. It appears amid the clash and opposition of all the diverse forces which characterize the modern scene, that nature is indeed straining to take the next major step forward to a new dawn. Yet above all, we realize that this clash and the final accord of opposites are in fact the supreme spurs of nature, through which she progressively achieves and will achieve her final evolutionary goal. It is as well, however, in the increasing disorder of mankind to examine the sources of these ancient aspirations and to see if we can where the light really is. For if in fact the light is thus the next higher step for humanity, as well as being the immanent reality it is experienced to be, then it is primarily that which can alter the surest aid and means to lift the mind of man out of his ever thickening darkness. In this endeavor, we have fortunately as a basis and a beginning the already existing records and footprints of man's successive attempts to reach those heights, such as have been preserved in the most ancient writings of India. It is such remains which belong also to the world's most ancient scriptures, and which represent the early dawn of man's awakening to a higher reality. For when we take a broader survey of human progress, we cannot with the same finality accept our present day culture as having emerged exclusively from one or two regional zones only, nor can we claim that the development of humanity progressed as uniformly as is generally supposed from the primitive to the civilized state. It is likely that many dawns of enlightenment had appeared, even in the midst of primitive past, and consequently the lines of cultural development which had produced therefrom should also be taken into account. This is especially so of the eastern branches of human knowledge, which have hitherto been all too rigorously excluded from Western thought. Of these, it is particularly the ancient Sanskrit works of India, with their original spirit faithfully preserved, which are undoubtedly the rich sources. They not only represent the earliest known efforts of man to scale the heights, but they are also the most complete existing record of that conscious endeavor. It is significant, therefore, in the widening sweep of modern thought, that men are turning more and more to these ancient writings in their search for long lost gleams of hidden truth. When we regard these ancient scriptures of India, particularly the Vedas and Upanishads, in their natural perspective, it is more apparent that they constitute no alien and irrelevant source of knowledge for modern men, but belong in fact to the very mainspring of their present endeavor. Thus, it is no stray coincidence to find that modern science, while clashing with the current Western beliefs concerning God and the world, has discovered principles that were surprisingly revealed to the penetrative insight of a more distant past. When we examine the substance of those poetic utterances preserved in the Vedic hymns with a more discerning eye than is usually given to them, that is, as the ancient Aryans visioned cosmic realities, which modern science is now progressively laying bare. Although the real meaning of these hymns is largely veiled from the Western mind by a pastoral imagery and symbol peculiar to their own times, we can see that the presence of an immortal was clearly observed in all that is mortal, and a secret nature not normally visible to our ordinary awareness was perceived to exist both within and behind the material world. The ancients not only knew an inner nature, but discerned the presence of a higher world of light and immortality, which itself finds representation within the soul of man. Thus, the whole effort and endeavor of the Vedic seers were directed towards bringing about a union of the higher with the lower in which man is immersed, or at least to find out the truth which would effect this. In the Upanishads also we find similar cogent truth revealed. In the annals of human experience, we find that there are records of a more vast and more infinite reality than that known and extensively unknown cosmic existence. Such is the transcendent one, the pure spirit in itself, the knowledge of which is more familiar to Indian spirituality than to the pattern and outlook of the materialistic West. It was thus the realization of that lofty, luminous reality beyond the universe which, at a certain stage of India's development, had become the chief central aim of her endeavor, and which had inevitably culminated in producing Sri Ramakrishna, who lived in worldly society and yet entirely renounced all worldly ties and attachments to become the lone pursuer of spirit for its own sake. His was an immense leap into the absolute, as well as of those intermediary steps which made up the dynamic cosmic reality, and which also marked out for man the course of his future evolutionary progress. The experiment conducted at the lonely sanctuary of Dakshineswar was indeed a gigantic one, almost undreamt of and almost unattempted by anyone in the whole spiritual history of mankind. Beyond the cosmos, he looked into the vastness of a world transcending consciousness, where infinite perfection the ancients had already observed and unveiled. There, what they had revealed lies the pure spirit itself, Atman, the divine ground of all existence, and the very universe, but a branching tree-like dependency of that of the supernal vastness. But just who or what can enter into and live in the cosmic consciousness? So it was found possible also to enter into oneness with that transcendent consciousness and become thereby completely detached and aloof from the universal activity and movement. It was indeed in that high and lofty vision above that the ancient seers were able to penetrate into the secrets of the higher reality and to realize its relation with the cosmos and with man. If the spiritual experiment at Dakshineswar consisted in attempting to grasp the immensity of the transcendence, it was left to the disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, particularly Vivekananda and Abhedananda, to make its practical application for widening the horizon of humanity, to enable it to embrace the wholeness of it. If Dakshineswar saw the dawn of light, the Baranagar Muth saw that light growing. Thus, any account of the days passed by Swami Abhedananda and his brother disciples at the Baranagar monastery must necessarily be the account of their intense spiritual awareness, And viewed historically, those were the days of soul preparedness, when the seeds of the spiritual evolution as well as spiritual revolution were partially sown on earth. Therefore, the monastery at Brahmanagar, in its extensiveness, was destined to accomplish God's will in the world, and those who were chosen to become the instruments of that accomplishment inherited in full the spiritual legacy left by the great master. The days of Kali Tapasi were spent at the Brahmanagar Muth in strict spiritual discipline, as laid down by Sri Ramakrishna. This discipline, of course, meant the practice of yoga, which gradually led him to the higher reaches of spirituality. As he began to acquire a new outlook on life through intense study, deep meditation, and constant worship, he began to realize more and more the true significance of knowledge, renunciation, and devotion, which the Master once described as the glories of illumination. Giving his early impression of the Muth, Swami Abhedananda thus writes in his autobiography, "After returning from Vrindavan, I found that the upper story of the old house of the Munshis of Taki had been hired at a monthly rent of 11 rupees, and the Muth started there by Suresh Mitra. There were Tarak, Gopal Jr., and Gopal Sr. I too stayed on. Naren, Sharat, and Shasi stayed at home and came off and on. There was no arrangement for the worship of the Master. We sat in meditation or for the telling of the beads in Japa Mantram before the Master's bed, and food got by begging was cooked by us in turns. The all-pervading quietness of the locality, with the Ganges flowing by, the leadership of Naren, and the spiritual fervor in his heart rising to white heat, the monastic life of Kali Tapasi soon bursted forth. He began to prepare himself for the goal which was indicated by Naren at Anpur, and he said, "Let man-making be the goal of our lives." And as we enter into the inner recesses of his life, we shall see that from the very beginning of his life at Brahmanagar, Swami Abhedananda had made this his only spiritual endeavor. Realization of God was not the only thought that was uppermost in his mind. Gradually, his whole existence became surcharged with the spirit of renunciation, which seemed to him as the highest ideal in life. The asceticism he practiced in those days reminds us of the ascetics of ancient India. It became, so to say, not only a creed, but an article of faith with him. All that he aspired now was to become an ascetic in the true sense of the term. Incidentally, we should mention another characteristic of the Brahmanagar Muth, without which the life story of Swami Abhedananda cannot be fully comprehended. It was the bond of brotherhood which had its first inception at Anpur. This bond, which subsequently became the bedrock of the whole structure of the Ramakrishna order and organization, was perhaps indissolubly forged at Baranagar. It was one organic cohesion that could escape nobody's notice, and every one was caught in its spell. It could not be otherwise, for the Master who had united them at Dakshineswar, Shamkapur, and Kosapur was still a living presence working through them. He who had lived in flesh and blood at Sri Ramakrishna was now about to reincarnate himself in this monastery. The future Ramakrishna Movement and mission was in fact nothing but steady flowering of this close bond known as the communion of apostles. The bond was the ideal itself, which the young sannyasins practiced with their heart and soul. It was not the gurua cloth that bound them together. Essentially, it was the well-knit bond of brotherhood that proved as a cohesive factor in the lives of the young disciples at that dilapidated house. And had it not been for this brotherhood, the disciples would not have survived amidst wants and poverty and scanty meals. Centuries ago, India had the privilege of witnessing the birth of such a brotherhood of monks, first in the Buddhist age, and thereafter during the period of Shankara. The idea was long lost to us, and therefore its revival is not known in all of its ways. But for the disciples, worship knew no limit. It went much beyond the formality. It seemed to us that they were nursing the Lord just in the same manner as we all did when Ramakrishna was in bodily form. They all participated in the food offered to the Master, sitting in front of his image, and most of the time that was spent in the adjoining room in meditation. Thus, if Anpur supplied the necessary spark to detonate the magazine of renunciation that Abhedananda, along with his brother disciples, had become after the Master's departure, it was Brahmanagar that brought about the historical fulfillment of the Brotherhood of Monks, which was truly conceived out of the ashes of Sri Ramakrishna. Thus, the Brotherhood, which developed through meditation, study, discussion, and music, and also at times through observation of various festivals, finally reached its spiritual peak, from where each member of the Brotherhood radiated a sort of influence to guide the destiny of mankind. In contrast with others, it was sharply and very distinctly noticed in the lives of Vivekananda and Abhedananda, when each of them appeared on the world stage.